second break session of the day and actually the last break session of the conference. We start off this session with a workshop on sleep by Dr. Talmo Pereira. Talmo is from the Saul Institute for Biological Sciences, and he's been working on developing post-estimation and computer vision and deep learning tools to study behavior, neuroscience, and even plants. So the floor is yours.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share a bit about our work. So I want to start with just giving a very broad, very general motivation here. I think we mentioned plans, so I want to kind of put that into a little bit of context for what kind of has motivated some of the recent work we've been doing. And a lot of that really derives from this very universal observation that life in all its forms really evolved in order to move. It evolved the ability to move, subject to the pressures of natural selection, to be able to maximize fitness. Movement is what allows animals and plants and all other forms of life to avoid threats, to move towards the resources that they need to survive, to find mates, and just in general be able to respond to dynamic and quickly changing environments. And so whether it's a plant growing through soil, a fly grooming its head, or a giraffe walking through the savannah, life evolved the ability to move. And so if we'd like to be able to understand how life works in all its different forms, it would behoove us to have a good way to quantify biological movement. In other words, we want to be able to go from images that look like this to a more distilled and essential description of biological movement that might look a little bit like this. So today, I want to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing to quantify biological movement using deep learning, the tools we've developed to do so. And then I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing to transform these insights into different types of essentially phenotypes, or what we might call identifiable behaviors that allow us to then better understand the underlying mechanisms of disease. And finally, we'll end with a little live demo of SLEAP, the algorithm that we've developed, the toolkit that we developed for animal pose tracking, and we'll see how that goes in real time. All right, no further ado, let's jump into our first section here on quantifying movement. So harkening back to 2015, these were some of the early days of the deep learning revolution. Some of the first approaches started to come out that had employed deep learning in order to achieve what's called pose estimation, also known as markerless motion capture. So motion capture has a long and storied history of especially being used in the graphics and film, other art industries. But anyone who's ever developed a tracker to understand animal behavior very much appreciates how truly majestic, how groundbreaking a little demonstration like this really is. We have here a dancer that's being recorded using essentially a handheld camera that is, not in a perfectly stable conditions. It's not imaged dead on, and it importantly features a dancer that's not only moving in and out of plane, but worse still, is wearing black clothes against a black background, making the job of doing something like background segmentation nearly impossible. And yet we were still able to see these amazing results. And so motivated by some of the early results that we were seeing in around that time in human pose estimation, we decided to see if we could adapt this to the domain of animals. And so one of the first challenges we faced was the fact that while for human pose estimation, there existed these massive data sets that were already annotated at great expense in using methods like crowdsourcing. Anytime we have a new animal in a new lab, in a new species, or a new body configuration, we would have exactly 0 labeled images. This is what we call the labeled data problem. And it wasn't really clear, especially at the time, how we could possibly deal with this. Because at the end of the day, especially at that time, it was thought that the magic of deep learning really derived from having lots and lots of data. And so to address this, we developed the predecessor of SLEAP, a method called LEAP, standing for Leap Estimates Animal Pose, a key recursive acronym, courtesy of Diego Durando, then my undergraduate mentee, now a PhD student at Harvard. And LEAP worked in a pretty similar way to how the human pose estimation models did. It starts off with a raw image of our animal, here a fruit fly. We feed that image into a convolutional neural network, and then have the neural network learn to predict a spatial probabilistic representation of the locations of each body part that we call confidence maps. These confidence maps you can think of as essentially heat maps corresponding to the locations in the image in which the animal is most likely to be located. And so our key intuition in developing SLEAP was that perhaps if we design a convolutional neural network architecture that has fewer parameters, it would also require fewer labeled data, thereby getting us around this labeled data problem. And this contrasts with other approaches that leverage things like transfer learning, which still use a very large-scale neural network, but attempt to essentially reuse features that are learned on a more general task. We like this approach for a variety of reasons, but let me just go ahead and show you how well this works. So we definitely found pretty quickly that this approach indeed was very sample efficient. And what that meant was that even with as little as 10 labeled images, totally random initialization, but using this small lightweight neural network, we would get fairly reasonable results. So here what we have are the outer circles corresponding to the 90th percentile of the error distribution. And by the time that we get to around a couple hundred labeled images, we were getting to basically plateauing or nearly perfect accuracy. And the other thing that this lightweight network architecture enabled is a whole workflow that we call human-in-the-loop labeling. Essentially, by being able to train these neural networks that are very lightweight, very fast, on the order of minutes, we can also then predict on unlabeled frames very fast, import those predictions into the graphical user interface that we developed for annotation, and then only correct the errors that the neural network is making rather than having to label the images from scratch. And what we found was that this drastically reduced the amount of time required to label each image, taking us down from around 2 minutes per image to just a few seconds. Okay, but one of the key classes of behaviors that we were interested in studying when we were developing these tools was really was that of social behaviors. And it turns out that there are some unique challenges to doing pose estimation with multiple animals. So while it was easy for us to extend our approach of doing landmark localization or pose estimation to the domain of multiple animals, we can find multiple copies of all the heads and all the tails. We're faced with two additional challenges that are unique to this setting. One is that of part grouping. In other words, assuming that we found all the heads and all the tails, which head goes with which tail? This is a very non-trivial problem, as I hope this clip can illustrate, because you can't simply take the one that's closest to the other one. We really need to be able to reason about the relationship between these body parts. And this is especially salient in the case of social behaviors in which the animals are closely interacting. And the second is that of identity assignments. This is the broader task of, say that you detect an animal in one frame, detect a set of animals, and then in the next frame, how do we ensure that they are the same animal? And this is a much larger problem that has a much longer history of research that extends beyond the task of pose estimation, or in this case, pose tracking, and that you've likely seen some other approaches try to tackle in different ways. In particular, I want to highlight ID tracker as another a pretty prominent method that we like to recommend to folks who deal with this problem more directly. But okay, we had these issues. We were able to do post-estimation. We just solve these additional problems. How do we go about it, right? This motivate the existence of these problems really motivated us to kind of go back to the drawing board and start from scratch in developing the successor of LEAP that we call SLEAP, or Social LEAP Estimates Animal Poses. And so SLEAP was really developed to not only solve these additional problems, but to really be designed as a framework that can effectively encompass all the individual subtasks associated with this entire workflow. Not only that, but it can encompass many different types of methods to solve these individual problems. We won't have too much time to get into the technical specifics, but we'll cover a couple of the details. And so the idea is that SLEAP is intended to take you from having raw videos and through to annotation through a very accessible user interface. We'll take a look in a minute. Training the deep neural networks, doing the pose estimation itself, doing the identity tracking, and then pulling everything back in for inspection and proofreading. It's really designed for any kind of animal, any species, any morphology, any imaging condition, essentially anything that you can imagine. If you can see it, you can track it, and so forth. And so here's just a small little gallery of the types of data sets that we were developing SLEAP on when we were originally writing our manuscript. And so I hope you can appreciate the diversity of imaging conditions, color, grayscale, infrared, visible light, different species, different body types, and even within the categories of the same species, dealing with data that has different noise properties. And so I mentioned this part grouping problem, and one of the realizations we quickly had was that there's multiple alternative approaches to solving this part grouping problem. And without getting too much into the technical details, suffice to say that what we found was that there are trade-offs between different classes of approaches to part grouping that are going to simply just work better in their different settings. And so what we made in SLEAP is created the flexibility to allow us to implement these different workflow types that are largely just transparent to the users. You can basically just choose from a dropdown which kind of neural network approach you want to use. And we show in our paper that some of them are going to work better under some settings as compared to others. Same deal with the identity tracking problem. We offer two classes of approaches. One, which is a classical multi-object tracking or tracking by detection framework, which is essentially trying to model the motion of our animals across time. And that identification by appearance or re-identification. This actually closely mimics the approach taken by approaches like by algorithms like ID tracker and others. And so this one has the advantage of being able to learn about the distinctions between the visual appearances of different animals and not having any temporal dependencies, making it compatible with real time. And so given the fact that we have this capability, we wanted to see how much can we push this system for real-time applications. And we demonstrated that we could, in a proof of principle closed loop experiment, essentially select the between this sort of real-time mode and batch mode. And in this real-time experiment, where our goal is to minimize latency, what we were able to do is essentially do tracking on 13 body parts on each of two animals. So we're locating 26 landmarks, we're grouping them, we're identifying them, and we're using this signal in an experiment in which we've designed to such that the female fruit fly that you're seeing here on the right is sexually receptive by design, but because we can detect the social behavior of her partner, this male, we're able to then optogenetically activate a set of neurons in her brain, causing her to artificially reject him in a context in which she would not have otherwise. So put in other words, we're able to, in real time, track the movements of these two animals, detect the behavior of one animal, use that to control the social behavior response of another one. And this kind of is a demonstration of the kind of experimental paradigms this unlocks. And to make this even more accessible and user-friendly, we've worked with other folks in the open source community to implement a version of real-time sleep in Bonsai, which we strongly recommend for folks who are designing their experimental workflows around the use of these kinds of real-time tools. And so, as I mentioned, right, we developed SLEAP really with a big emphasis on accessibility, and really that's all driven by a strong commitment to industry-grade software engineering. Our philosophy on the design of these kinds of computational methods is that the science is absolutely important, but so is the construction, right? I mean, if you're gonna develop a new microscope, I would hope that you have a really strong dedication to optics and other aspects of the engineering of the system. In the same way, we believe that tool building for software should be guided by best-in-class principles for designing software systems. And so here we don't have time to really get into every one of these little blocks, but they all have their own little story for how we came about designing it and how that enables new functionalities. So I think as part of our emphasis on mature industry-grade software engineering and design, we've really made one of the things that people have told us they really like about SLEAP is its usability and user-friendliness. We've had everybody, from middle schoolers to what I think is a more challenging class of users, the more senior PIs, be able to use it very effectively in their own settings and applications. And as a result, we've seen a pretty steady user growth over the last couple of years in a very active and vibrant community on our GitHub and as part of the larger open source ecosystem. And we'll see a little bit more about this, but I want to just take a second here to really shout out, give a really strong shout out to folks like Liesl Marie, our lead software engineer, as well as the many other folks who have made contributions to the SLEAP code base. Okay, so where are we going next with some of this stuff? I do want to mention, unfortunately, this is forgot to remove this little poster reference down here. This is from the Society for Neuroscience conference this past week. But one of the things we're working on is an extension to essentially enable you to use SLEAP for doing 3D pose tracking using multiple views through an integration with another open source software called AnyPose. And we'll be disseminating a lot more information about this over the next few months. Finally, some of the end goals that we have for this kind of work, and sorry, let me get this video playing here one more time. Cool. One of the end goals that we have with this kind of work is essentially to be able to do this kind of 3D motion capture to study not only animal and human behaviors, but really to study it in the context of the processes that give rise to it, right? Essentially, one of the things we've been doing is working to recreate the environment in which these behaviors are evolving so that we can reconstruct what our subjects are seeing and use that to drive our models of how behavior is generated. And this is kind of just one of the unique things that I think this type of technology can really unlock. Cool. So that's just a short synopsis of some of the work we've been doing over the past few years in developing the tools and technologies for quantifying movement in its different forms. In the second part of the talk, I just want to show you a quick glimpse into one of the core applications that we've been developing for this technology here at the Salk Institute since I started my lab a couple of years ago. And that is to try to use movement as a lens into disease. And so a very natural way to apply this technology is to basically do it at scale. And so we've been developing a large-scale phenotyping system to essentially be able to record our animals' behaviors in a very, as naturalistic as we can setting within the lab, which is their home cage. They're the place where they live throughout their whole lives. And here the goal is to basically record and monitor them 24/7 in the environment that they're going to be living in, totally uninterrupted, without any perturbation, without any levers or any kinds of classical tasks, but instead just use SLEAP to track all the movements and kinematics of every part of their body, and use that as a way to extract all sorts of features that can tell us about different kinds of diseases. And I particularly want to highlight and shout out some of the work of Vivek Kumar at the Jackson Labs that has really pioneered this general approach for understanding the biology of disease using behavior and motion. And so the idea is that we record these animals 24/7, and then we end up capturing this massive amount of data on the kinematics of where each body part of the animal is 50 times per second for 24/7 for months and months at a time. And that, here's like a very, very small subset of one of our pilot data sets. We're flattening here out all the dynamics of each body part collected over 4 weeks. And here we're just plotting a teeny tiny subset of 2.6 million frames, corresponding to around 39 million data points of just 2 animals. And so our goal was to then basically see what kinds of patterns can we extract and how these dynamics evolve over time. Now, as you might imagine, that's going to be really challenging. It's a lot of data to look at. It's a lot of really nuanced and subtle patterns. And so using a mouse model of a neurodegenerative disease called ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, that leads to progressive loss of motor function, we wanted to see if we could tease out any kinds of changes that would occur in this high-dimensional behavior. And to do that, we've been collaborating with some of our friends at Stanford and Harvard to use SLEAP together with a probabilistic model that gives you behavioral syllables, or essentially it does behavioral segmentation by just identifying patterns in essentially the body language that are expressed through these pose trajectories. We highly recommend Keypoint MoSeq. It's well integrated with SLEAP, and really one of the state-of-the-art approaches for extracting structure from these pose tracks. And so the idea is that at every frame, you're going to have an identity of which behavioral syllable or sort of atom of movement is going to be identified based on the statistics of the movements. And so when we did the very simplest possible analysis that we could think of using this approach, we get something like what you see here on the right. And you'll note that on the y-axis, we just have these syllable numbers. And this is because one of the features of this approach is that it's fully unsupervised. It defines the structure of behavior entirely based on the statistics of the movements, rather than any human-based definition. And so when we look at these different syllables, and really just the change in expression of these syllables, we see that some of them occur a lot more later into the progression of the disease, and some occur a lot less. If we look at one example of the ones that occur a lot less, it makes total sense, and it aligns with our prior expectations of what would happen as its motor neuron disease progresses. The animals begin to do this type of climbing behavior a lot less over time. Right? This is something that we expect them to not be able to do as they lose their ability to coordinate motor function. And similarly, we can look at all the ones that occur more and the ones that occur less, and find that we can essentially create a very quantitative, entirely data-driven profile of what happens as these animals progress with disease. And our end goal is to leverage this kind of analysis in order to be able to predict the occurrence of this disease well before the more overt phenotypes or symptoms might be occurring, and hopefully use this to guide the development of new therapeutics. We're working on now scaling this way up. We're building many dozens of these home cages, improving our imaging conditions and so forth. And we're aiming to develop some of the largest scale data sets that describe not only naturalistic animal behavior, but behavior under different disease contexts. And finally, I just have to mention this because we're super excited to be embarking on this work. This is in collaboration with Lauren Sanders and Ryan Scott at NASA. We're now working to essentially apply these same exact techniques to study the behavior of mice in microgravity in the International Space Station. This is a project that we internally call very fondly Space Sleep, where the goal here is to do the same understanding, except that is they try the same kind of understanding that we can for movement capture, but doing so in the context of microgravity. And the end goal of this project is try to understand how can we create automated systems and more sensitive systems to both understand the basic biology of spaceflight, but also to guide crew health monitoring to enable deep space exploration. Great. So that concludes the second portion here, where I told you a little bit about some of the applications we've been developing with this technology. I didn't get a chance to quite tell you about the plans, but we might kind of circle back to that in a couple of minutes. So for this last portion here, what I want to take the time to show you is a little bit about how sleep works itself. So we're going to do this totally from scratch. Let's see how that goes. But before we jump into this demo, just want to say thanks to all the awesome, amazing folks in the lab who really have been doing all the work that I've been showing you today, all of our collaborators, and in particular, all of our funding sources, which allow us to keep this whole train running. So with that, let's go back into the demo and see a little bit about what sleep looks like. As I transition here, definitely let me know if there's any questions or anything coming up. We try to tackle those as we switch over. So let me just reshare here. 1 second. Cool. All right. Awesome. So I want to start off by just showing you a little bit about where your entry point to sleep is going to be, and that includes our website. So if you go to sleep.ai, SLEAP, you're going to find our documentation page. It has lots of useful info. In particular, here's our installation page. It's going to guide you all the way through, even doing the basics like how do you open a terminal, how do you install the dependencies, and so forth. Supports every operating system and platform. And then in here, we're going to have our tutorial. It will, again, walk you through every individual step. It has little movies, and essentially it'll allow you to it'll show you click by click how to go through the whole workflow, which we'll also be doing here in just a moment. And then we have a lot more advanced guides on things like getting better results, running stuff remotely on Google Colab, as well as notebooks for doing things more interactively once you're ready to kind of level up to the next stage of how you use sleep for your own work. And finally, I want to highlight our GitHub, which I mentioned has been the main place where you're going to go to get help and support. So you'll see here we have lots. It's a very actively developed project. We have thousands upon thousands of commits, hundreds of thousands of lines of code, lots and lots of authors and contributors, and a lot of work that's still very actively pending. Lots of issues and bug reports that we're constantly working through and cataloging. And I assure you that if you post it, we're looking at it and we're working on fixing it. But the primary place you're probably going to go to is our discussions page. So this is a forum-like website where you can create a new discussion, asking for help, or suggesting new ideas. And we love new suggestions for ideas of new features in sleep. But you'll see that, here we have, a few hours ago, a few days ago, going back to, a while now through hundreds and hundreds of threads of folks who have asked questions. And we really strongly recommend that folks ask questions here, because other folks will be able to benefit from the discussions. And it's almost certainly the case that if you have a question, certainly someone else has had that question. If they haven't, likely someone will have that question again in the future. You can benefit from that support. Okay, so we have 30 minutes here. Let's see how quick we can train a sleep model. So I'm going to go over here to our datasets page, and I'm going to have a little testing clip here. It's going to be a pretty straightforward video. I'm going to right click to save it. I'm going to save it over here on my desktop. I'm going to go over to my desktop, and here's our mouse video. I'm going to double click it, and you can see it's just a pretty standard mouse video of 2 mice in a home cage. I'm going to open a terminal here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate our sleep environment, which is already pre-installed here. But this is essentially a one-line installation. You don't need anything special to be able to run sleep. If you have a GPU in your computer, it will automatically figure out how to best install all the associated dependencies so that you can effectively be able to utilize your GPU. You don't need to use Docker. You don't need to install any other dependencies on your computer other than just having your GPU drivers updated. That means you don't need to install CUDA. You don't need to worry about everything breaking if anything updates. Everything's self-contained within Conda. Okay, great. So here's what the default sleep project screen looks like. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by adding this video that we just downloaded. This is an MP4. This is our video import screen. And you can see that we have a little table here that shows all the videos. We recommend that you add multiple videos so that the models that you train are able to generalize to different conditions under which you're recording. And so down here is our seek bar. We can kind of track and skip around in the video. And the first thing we're going to do is define which body parts we're going to track. We're going to do build a really simple skeleton consisting of just the head and the torso and the tail base, right? And here we're just going to connect this torso out to the head, this torso out to the tail base to make a visually appealing skeleton. And then we have this guy here, which is the labeling suggestions. It's essentially gonna sample out a bunch of frames for annotation. You can think of this as essentially creating a little queue of things for you to label. And the idea with the different methods that we have for generating suggested frames to label is that we want to maximize the diversity in the frames that we're annotating. And so let's just go ahead and get started with the annotation by essentially just right-clicking. You can click on the default mode for creating the skeletons. I'm going to tweak the appearance here just a little bit, just to make things a little bit easier to see, likely on the stream, or make these nodes real big, really easily visible. Make these little wedges here. And then I'm going to do some things like, for example, I can just click on this guy and move it over. I can scroll in and essentially be able to zoom into any arbitrary level that I want in order to be able to see where these points should really fall. But for our purposes, we're just going to make this pretty coarse. Now, if I create another instance, it's essentially just going to create a copy of the first one, which helps us because now we can drag the whole thing by holding Alt and then only adjusting the other ones. This is going to make it really fast to do some annotation. So I'm going to skip ahead again, do the same thing. It's going to copy it. You can see we can do things like here I'm using the scroll wheel to rotate the whole skeleton, making it again really fast to annotate. Let's do that labeling one more time and see if how close we can get it. Zoom in, click and drag, zoom in, click and drag, put this guy out in the middle. Yeah, I'm going to go over here, do another frame that's a little bit different. And we're going to do this for maybe about 5 or 6 frames or so, and then see how we do. And now you'll recall, right, from earlier in the talk that I mentioned that These are, the deep learning really tends to work way better with tons and tons of data. So we're really going to be pushing on how well this system can work when we label just a handful of frames, right? Meaning we're going to be training a neural network model that essentially has never seen what an animal looks like. So we're going to see how far we can really push this idea that using these lightweight neural networks, we can train models with very little data, right? And keep in mind that I'm going to be training this on a GPU, but on a single workstation GPU. Nothing too special. I don't need like a big fancy compute cluster, nor do I need to spend a ton of money on specialized hardware to be able to use this stuff. Okay, so this is probably the last frame I'll label. I think we've captured enough diversity here of the different kinds of frames that we're expecting to see. And I'll just highlight a couple of things also about this particular data set setup, which is that, it's really not ideal, right? It's really blown out. It's got a lot of issues related to the illumination and blur and so forth, but what we're doing this as a representative example. All right, so I just press Control S just to save the project. You'll see that I'll save it out to an SLP file. I'm gonna hit save. See that it automatically saves it as V001. And in fact, if you go to File, Save As, you can see that it automatically increments the version number to V002. And the goal of this is so that it should make it really easy for you to create multiple versions, so that as you're working through it, through labeling your data set, you should be making lots and lots of versions so that you can always go back to the previous versions if you ever need to. All right, let's start setting up the training in the interest of time and see how well we can do with a very limited time budget. So we're going to do this using our multi-animal top-down pipeline. As I mentioned, we have a few different pipeline types. You select from the drop-down. We're just going to do this one. We're going to say that we only have 2 instances. We're going to use the torso as our anchor part. And again, these are all pretty standard parameters that you can check out in our documentation for how to best select these. But this is all going to be pretty standard. So one of the things I'm going to do is reduce the resolution of our images. Again, it's not going to give us the best performance, but it'll train hopefully pretty quickly. And here you can see that we have a few different presets for how we can train these models. And what I'll do here is, again, reduce the size of these models. It can be a little intimidating. There's a lot of parameters here. We're certainly working on making this even more accessible. But for the most part, you can leave these guys at the defaults or select from one of the presets from the drop-down. All right, so I've configured the two parts of the model that we're going to train all through the GUI. There's no coding involved. We can do a few different things here, like saving out this configuration, even copy the whole configuration to the clipboard if you just want to be able to copy paste that in different places. And what I'll note is I can also export this whole thing as a training package, which essentially will package together in a single zip file all the data that you need to train it, as well as the configuration and some scripts to run it, allowing you to basically port this whole thing over to your institution's cluster, to another computer, to Google Colab, or wherever else, so that you don't need to run it locally. But I do have a GPU available here locally, so I'm just going to hit run, and let's see what happens. What is the worst that could happen, right? So what happens now in the background, and I'll just show you in the terminal, because there's a lot of stuff kind of cropping up over here, is that SLEAP is now essentially configuring the neural network. It's loading in the data. It's figuring out all sorts of parameters and settings for you based on the configuration that we specified. It's selecting the GPU automatically. It's building the neural networks. It's splitting up the data. It's setting up the architecture, and then connecting all that up with the front end as it creates optimizations around how it's going to load and augment the data for its real-time training. And within a few seconds, you'll see that we begin to see this loss curve appear. The goal of the neural network training step is to basically decrease the loss, which conversely increases the accuracy in real time. And so you're able to see that where each dot here corresponds to a batch of 4 images that it's training on. And what you'll see pop up soon is this visualization of those part confidence maps that I mentioned. So you can see that within less than a minute, we're now getting to pretty reasonable results. right? Like here we have this in green, this sort of heat map of where the sleep model thinks that the mice are located at in a validation, in a held out image, right? Where the red dot corresponds to where it's predicting the centroid of the animal is, and the green dot is where we actually labeled it before. This is pretty good considering we're being pretty coarse and quick and dirty about it. And so we'll give this a few more seconds to let it, kind of do its thing and continue to optimize how well it does on these images. And you can see that we can switch over to the training, and you can see how well it's doing on the other images that it actually is training on. But the validation images really give you a sense of how well it generalizes. And we have on this curve here on the left, sort of a little bit about this sort of training dynamics, where the blue curve corresponds to the training data that the neural network in SLEAP has actually seen, and in orange, its performance on data that it's never seen before. And so what SLEAP does is it'll essentially use the performance on the validation set, on the images it hasn't seen, as a indicator for how well the neural network is doing. So you can see that it's starting to plateau out because it's overfitting on the training set. In this case, the training and validation sets are so small. I mean, the validation set is literally a single image. The training set is 6 images. So we know that these estimates are not going to be perfect, but they still give us a rough idea of how well it's doing. What SLEAP will do is eventually it'll stop by itself once it detects that we're no longer improving in terms of our validation. I'm going to give it just a few more seconds to keep doing its thing in case it does manage to improve a little bit in terms of validation. But in general, it kind of just seems like it's largely just overfitting on the training set. SLEAP will automatically adjust things like the learning rate, and will stop early to prevent further overfitting. But I think that it's fair to say that I think with 6 labeled images, oh no, there you go. We updated it one more time. I think that's probably going to be good. So we trained for a total of 3 minutes, including the setup time. So I'm just going to hit stop early, which will send a request to the SLEAP training backend to call it a day. Trained it for 3 minutes, deep neural network, a few million parameters. That's probably good enough. So what it'll do is now it'll stop. It'll compute a bunch of metrics. It'll save everything out, and then proceed to the next stage of training, which is the second stage of our top-down model, which now will take cropped images of our animals and try to predict the other key points of the pose. And so once again, if we look in the terminal, we'll see that the whole process is starting over again, where it's splitting up the images into training and validation. It's generating all of these. It's parsing all the configuration. It's inferring all these different settings that that we didn't have to specify, and it's setting up the training. And once again, we see this the process start up and keep going, right? So at the very beginning of training this model, we can see that it does quite well at predicting the initial central landmark. That's not surprising because the images are cropped around the center of the animal. But it then tries to predict the locations of the head and the tail. And you can see that, especially in the beginning, it's going to be a little bit confused about what's a head and what's a tail. It's not surprising, especially with these images. But we see that, even within just a few seconds, that loss starts to decrease dramatically. So we'll give it a couple more minutes to learn to do its thing. And what we'll see is that within, again, just a few seconds, it begins to learn how to recognize heads and tails of mice in this data set. Once again, I want to highlight the fact that we're training on 6 labeled images. It took us about 5 minutes or so to generate the training set, and it's taken us about 2 or 3 minutes to train each of these deep neural networks, which have millions of parameters, all on a single GPU. Nothing too crazy, and all it took is just a few seconds of labeling. And I'll highlight one more time that these are deep neural networks that are trained totally from scratch. We're not doing transfer learning. We're not cheating in any way where we've pre-trained this network on something else. This is learning totally, completely from scratch using initialized random weights. Okay, so I'll take a second now while we're watching this this guy train. You can see that. I'd love to see that loss curve go down.
Talma?
Yes, yeah,
So maybe if you have time, I can ask a couple of questions while we
yeah.
wait. So there's one question in the chat. David asked, I think it's about the 3D motion tracking that you showed, maybe not related to sleep, but he was wondering if it can be useful to detect balance issues in old people. He knows that he's aware that the risk of falling is predictable and dangerous. So do you know if people have used it in that sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think fall detection is one of the classic use cases for this type of technology. There's a bunch of commercial solutions for doing automated fall detection, but I know that there's quite a lot of uh, uh, research really that in the more human clinical sort of like biomechanics and orthopedics worlds that leverage in particular commercial motion capture systems that are marker based to do fall detection. It's definitely one setting in which you do want to have maximum accuracy by having fiducial markers. It's not too hard, at least in a research setting, to ask people to wear the equivalent of motion capture suits. But we and others have used it to essentially try to pull out things like frailty indices that are related to stability and locomotion. And in particular, I would highlight, maybe I can pull this up in real time here. Yeah, well, it's the first one that came up. This this paper from Vivek Kumar, who I gave a shout out to earlier, called a machine vision based frailty index for mice, in which they use pose tracking precisely to identify aging related frailty metrics in a preclinical model. That said, in humans, I mean, that there's a lot of work to pull out these kinds of metrics. All you need is to have some good tracking, and it's certainly something that's very feasible using methods like SLEAP, and in particular, as we move into 3D.
Thank you. There's another question, I guess, I mean, it looks like it might be improving still a little.
Yeah. No, we can stop this whenever, but I think the question.
Yeah. So there's Christina Hansen-Wheat, and they're saying super cool stuff, and they have two questions. One, how does Sleep handle different camera angles?
Right.
Like if it's from above or from the side. And the second question is, it seems like Sleep will be useful for identifying behavior, for instance, a dog running versus standing or wagging its tail. If so, how fine scale behavior can Sleep be trained on?
Right. Let me talk about those questions. Let me just mention real quick what's happening here on the screen. So without me stopping it, I think as you noted, it seemed like Sleep was pretty much good to go a minute ago. And in fact, it detected that automatically and stopped the training early. And what happens after training is we enter that human in the loop workflow where now it imports in the predictions on the different frames. And so now I'm skipping around to different frames that the model has never seen. And you can see that on some of these frames, it actually does reasonably well. And some of them, it gets the head and tail mixed up. It kind of doesn't get the key points quite in the right place. But in some of them, it's already quite good, like here, right? Let me come back to that in a second, and I'll show you the last step, which is tracking. Let me just answer the question. And so, how does Sleep handle different camera angles, such as above or from the side? I mean, that's a great question. I've shown you primarily stuff in which we're imaging the animals from above. This is primarily because this is where we get the most visibility and most consistent visibility of the animals. The issue with imaging from the side is that there's just a lot of occlusions or missing information that's just simply not visible. It can definitely handle it, and we've used it plenty, with different camera angles. Excuse me. But you're going to get better performance the more visible your key points are. But technically, it's possible, and all you need to do is do a little bit more annotation. In terms of the second question, it seems that Sleep will be useful for defining behavior, for instance, a dog running versus standing or wagging its tail. If so, how fine scale behavior can Sleep be trained on? And defining as in coding. Got it. Yeah, so essentially, if you can see it, you can identify it, you can classify those behaviors. It's just a matter of what you're using downstream. And I'll say that SLEAP is compatible natively with things like Keypoint MoSeek, which does this in a supervised fashion. It's compatible with things like Simba, B-side, or A-side, all of which work downstream of SLEAP, take SLEAP inputs, and allow you to provide examples of when a waggle versus a standing might be occurring, such that it can then predict those automatically by using the SLEAP pose as input. But technically speaking, this is outside of the domain of what SLEAP itself does. SLEAP takes an image as input and produces a set of key point coordinates as output. Let me, before I take the next question, just real quick show you what it looks like once we have a training model. And so I'm going to go and do my best practice here of just saving it again. I'm going to save a version 3. And I'll also just point out that we now have this models folder that contains the models that we just trained. So I'm going to save that out. Great. And what I'll do is I'm going to select a little region here that might be a little bit tricky for us to track, but we'll give it a go anyways. I just held shift and just selected a little portion of around 1,000 frames or so. We're going to run inference on that, and we're also going to run tracking on it. That runs a little bit slower than doing either by itself, but I think for the purposes of the demo, we'll be okay. Okay, so we're going to select just a couple of default settings here, blah, blah, not too important. I'm just going to hit run. Mostly I'm just telling SLEAP that there's only 2 animals in this clip. And so it likely will get a couple of identity switches, but I hope it does so that we have a little opportunity to show what happens when that occurs. So what's doing right now is loading up the neural networks, processing all of the configurations, and essentially figuring out how to pre-process the data so that it can then generate and then predict on new frames. But you can see it does at a fairly steady clip here using these lightweight models. So in just a few seconds, it's now tracked over 1,000 frames, both in terms of generating the poses and tracking their identities over time. And so we can kind of just see what that looks like. And you can see it's definitely pretty noisy, right? We've only trained this model on a handful of frames. It still gets the head and tail mixed up a lot, particularly when the animals are pretty much vertical. But for the most part, especially when the animals aren't interacting, it's keeping track of their identities pretty reliably. And I hope in this clip that they're going to touch each other a little bit so we can see what happens when there's a switch. But we might have no such luck. Probably should have picked a harder clip, I guess. Yeah, that's okay. Well, in any case, you get the idea of what happens, right, when we run the actual tracking. And now what we have are key point coordinates for our animals, as well as represented by the colors, their actual identities. And what we can now do is going to save this guy's new version, but we can also now export this to a variety of different formats, including HDF5, it's a portable numeric data format that's very popular in scientific computing. We export it to a CSV, so we can import wherever else. And we can export to NWB, or the Narrow Data Without Borders format, a new data standard that we highly recommend that folks try out and use. Okay, I think that kind of can conclude the tutorial portion of this, guy. So I'll just recap and mention that in the last let's say about 20 minutes, we downloaded a new MP4, a new behavior video that's pretty noisy and pretty standard of 2 animals. We opened up SLEAP, we loaded up the video into SLEAP, we defined which body parts we want to track, we defined, I'm sorry, let me click through here and show you. So we imported a video, we defined the skeleton, defined the body parts that we want to track, we generated some work for ourselves, essentially a labeling queue that are going to be sampled from across our video. These are the frames we're going to annotate. We labeled around 7 frames, totally manually and from scratch. Then we trained 2 neural networks. We saw the results in real time, and we imported the predictions back in, and we saw how well they do along these different frames. One thing I guess I didn't get a chance to show you, maybe now is a good opportunity, is what happens in terms of what we can do with these predictions. And what you can see is that we can essentially double click each one of these predictions and essentially move them around to correct them, right? And so it's not exactly perfect, but it's a lot less work than labeling it from scratch, because now all I'm doing is just tweaking the annotation that we had before. And some of them it's already doing quite well. So all I need to do is just double click these guys and say, yeah, that's correct. And now these two, this image is in our training data. And this is the part of the process that makes it much faster to generate new label frames. And finally, the last thing that we did was to take our trained model and then apply it to a contiguous clip of video data. It showed that we can track reliably not only the individual body parts, but also the identities of these animals. Okay, cool.
Quite fast. I think we have some questions on the YouTube chat. So I'm asked, really cool, interested if SLEAP can detect individuals when they are in and out of the frame based on their characteristics. For example, when an individual is coming in or out of a shelter in the same video.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I briefly mentioned the fact that we have these different kinds of models for doing identity, and what I just showed you in real time was using our motion-based tracker. And using the motion-based tracking, once you lose track of an animal, eventually it's going to be really hard to tell if it's the same animal or not, particularly if they're visually indistinguishable. But as others have shown, most notoriously ID tracker, it's machine learning, these deep learning methods are quite good at identifying the distinctions between different animals, and so where possible, we do want to take advantage of that. And one of the ways that we do that is through these visual identity-based models. And so the way that works is, again, by essentially training these neural networks to learn to tell individuals apart purely based on their individual characteristics. And if I can load this up quickly enough, and probably I can't, show you a little bit about what that looks like. Let me pull up a quick video here, and if I can't do it in the next 10 seconds, we can move on to the next one. But suffice to say that technically, yes, it's here we go, got it. Perfect. Share my screen one more time. Cool. Right, so this is a gerbil data set from Dan Sain's lab at NYU, where they don't exactly have the animals leaving the frame, but they have a much cuter problem, which is that in studying gerbils, they're a very social animal that tend to do this type of huddling, or these really, I like to call them these cuddle piles a lot, during which the animals do effectively disappear because they're just fully underneath each other. And you can see that the pose tracking gets a lot less reliable when that happens, right? It's noisy, the key points jump around between different animals. But because they have these distinguishing visual markers, namely that their size and, in this case, fur shaving patterns, we're able to train an identity model that can essentially predict which animal is which without relying on temporal cues at all, just purely based on their appearance. And so what will happen is that once they reappear, SLEAP is able to resolve the identities that we weren't able to see before by leveraging these appearance cues. So if you're able to put any type of visual markers, then that'll resolve that problem. But if not, you can also still use it and use manual correction-based tools that we also provide in the user interface.
Great. I think there was a question by Aishwan. She asked, she saw that you labeled all visible body parts despite the mouse positioning. For example, when it was on the side or flat. Would you recommend to label all body parts if possible at all angles, including, say, for example, upside down poses, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say that the most accurate and correct answer really is that that's an open research question. This is what is sometimes referred to as hallucination, but I think more accurately we would call it imputation, which is we can follow a labeling strategy of trying to use your best guess of where those body parts are located. Or you can use a feature in SLEAP to essentially right-click one of those nodes and mark them as not visible. And what that will do is to teach the model to essentially not try to guess at where those body parts are located if you can't see them. And this can lead to essentially a higher precision, essentially at the cost of recall. What that means is essentially we'll only get to those that we're really sure about, and we won't try to make a guess about the ones that we're not super sure about, so that we don't have any noisy nodes. But in some applications, in some settings, you might want to just get a guess, even if it's coarse or noisy, no matter what. In those cases, you can also do that by just simply, in your own annotation, marking them as not visible. As far as what is best, it's really application dependent. Do you absolutely need those body parts at all times? Are your animals in poses such as upside down poses very frequently, such that if you never labeled occluded body parts, that you have so little data that you wouldn't be able to analyze it? It's totally up to you and what kind of information you want to extract from it. But at the end of the day, the most important thing to do is to be consistent about it. You can essentially guide and train these neural networks to do whatever you want it to do, so long as you're being consistent with the rules that you're following in doing that kind of annotation.
Thank you. I guess that is all the questions we have from chat right now, and we are nearly at the end. So maybe I ask one last question, and
Sure.
I think it goes along with the sensory inputs part that you were talking about, and that is something that you want to integrate. I guess I've heard some people talk about getting models that are useful for animal object interactions, like when an animal is interacting with an object just based on the pose of the animal, and say for example where the object is in the video or something. Is that something along the lines of what you're looking to develop SLEAP into, or is that something?
Yeah, 100%. Something we already kind of pretty routinely do. And I'll show you one example of that as part of our whole disease phenotyping approach, where here what you can see is that we have a bunch of ROIs that we've defined along the scene. And the kinds of things that we can do when we have the pose is essentially to compute all sorts of geometric features, such as the overlap between animals, overlap between an animal's head and the feeder, overlap between the animal's body and different objects within the environment. And we can use that to derive these kinds of time-varying metrics that tell us a little bit about what the animal is doing with respect to its environment. And here we've defined these ROIs semi-manually, but lots of our users have shown us that they can essentially train SLEAP itself to track objects in the environment. These can be moving objects that you just won't know the coordinates by hand, or it can be static ROIs that maybe just differ in their positioning across different sessions or different rigs. In both of those cases, what you can do is essentially train a SLEAP model to predict those same coordinates. SLEAP really isn't limited to just animals. I mentioned plants already, obviously, but certainly can also work on static objects, just as a very general purpose landmark detector. And once you have that, it's just a matter of just doing a little bit of the geometry to extract these different kinds of features.
Sounds quite good. I think that's all the time that we have for now. I guess Tanmo is available on Discord. So if you have any further questions, you can message him there or on the GitHub discussion forum. I must say that it's quite helpful to have people discussing it there.